Hello and welcome to all to this webinar on co-constructing psychologies for liberation, placemaking, healing and epistemic justice, which is hosted by APA Division 52 International Psychology. This webinar is part of the series titled Visions from the Global South to celebrate the activities of psychologists that live in the Global South, to provide useful information for international engagement and to encourage us to take a broad and global perspective. This webinar series has been founded by the Interdivisional Grant Culturally Competent Counseling Vision from the Global South in partnership with Division 17 Counseling Psychology. My name is Pina Marsico. I am the president of Division 52, and along with Dr. Helen Neville, past president of Division 17, we are your co-hosts for today's webinar. I want to thank the members of the webinar committee, Dr. Tio Lazarus, the chair, Dr. Tatiana Noor, and Raffaele Modugno. Before we begin, our online audience have the ability to ask questions by typing them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. Please feel free to type your question during the presentation, and Dr. Noor will be making note of them, organizing them, and during the last 12 minutes or so, she will present them to our speaker. At this time, I leave the floor to Dr. Neville for her to introduce and welcome our guest speaker. Please, Ellen, is over you.
Thank you so much. I am so excited about this presentation by Dr. Christopher Sonn, and he is a professor at Victoria University at Melbourne in Australia on the land of Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. His research is amazing. If you haven't read it, please read his research. And he's also got some podcasts out there. I think he's doing some of the most interesting, fascinating work on decolonial psychology in terms of really applied work. His research is concerned with understanding and changing dynamics of oppression and resistance, examining structural violence such as racism and its effects on social identities, intergroup relations and belonging. He holds a visiting professorship of the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He's edited some really important work, including Decoloniality and Epistemic Justice in Contemporary Community Psychology. He also has a new book out. It's on the that just came out on the Handbook of Decolonial Community Psychology. In his spare time, he's the associate editor of two journals, the American Journal of Community Psychology and Community Psychology and Global Perspective. Some of the things I really appreciate about his work is that he works with community, alongside community, as opposed to on communities. And I'm just looking forward to the words. I feel very fortunate to share this space and to welcome Dr. Sonn.
Thank you, Helen and Pina. Let me just get this started so that I can make sure that everything's working. So you can all see that, okay? Okay, so thank you, Helen, Pina, and the two divisions who have invited me to do this webinar. I am really grateful and privileged to be asked to do this. So I've provided a title with lots of different concepts, but just before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge that I work at Victoria University with Wundani Balak on the land of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. It is on this land with many groups that I, a member of the African diaspora, a Black settler, is learning, deconstructing and co-constructing decolonial praxis in the context of liberation and community psychologies. Yeah, I've got a little image. This is an image that one of our students drew. She's a drama therapist and also uses art, and this is the way you can see her at the at the back with the colorful full hair. She's part of a collective that we started at our university called the Community Identity Displacement Research Network. And together we seek to build a scholarly community that is concerned with the critique of power and also committed to solidarity. So we've got a number of people in this group, and there's others who go in and out, but we've consistently had a core membership that have been working together since probably 2010, 2011, as we seek to work at the interface between university and community in lots of ways, to break down that sort of boundary or that binary, but also to locate ourselves as community, with community, alongside community. But it's a way of locating or just positioning myself, because I think as part of decolonial work, reflexivity and social positioning is integral as a practice in this work. So I share a brief little note. This is a note that my grandfather gave to me in my teens, and he wrote it in a book on the history of South Africa, my country of birth. And in it, he wrote that do make time to read this book. It will answer many of the questions in your inner being appertaining to the role the so-called colored South Africans were denied in the making of the history of the land of our birth. Never allow the next man to look down on you. Prepare yourself to meet any challenge and every challenge, and thank God Almighty for your parents and those before them. Remember, you are called to prove to the world that you are here in the image of God, whose name is I am. So it is with a commitment to decolonial practice that I position myself. And so in offering this message, it is a message that didn't mean much to me at the time when I was still a teenager, when I received it. And the sort of the, oops, I didn't mean to go there already. The meaning of the message, it's sort of become clearer. It's sort of an invitation, a provocation, a sort of demand. And I've been revisiting this, and more when I came to seek and understand how it is that we ended up in Australia, of all places. And so this message I've revisited during my PhD journey, and even in more recent times, it has taken on a different meaning. So I spent a long time thinking about this message, but partly because of our own displacement as people who migrated during the apartheid period. So the message to me, I guess, was a sort of opportunity to reflect, to look, and brought to the foreground, I think, so much of the socio-political, historical, cultural realities that have shaped the lives of those violently constructed as other, inferior, and less deserving. And in my case, as someone who had been constructed and positioned as colored in the South African context. So this is just a couple of quotes that comes from a project that we worked on, called the Apartheid Archive Project, that gives you a sense of the ideology of apartheid. The culture bomb, as Ngugi referred to it. And so sort of collectively, we are inspired by our elders, our ancestors, contemporary leaders, and people in everyday settings who continue to contest this erasure, the results of slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and the brutal practices of land dispossession, the culture bomb of whiteness. Ngugi referred to this. But the culture bomb wasn't only in South Africa. So I found myself as an immigrant to Australia in the 80s during the apartheid period. And in Australia, of course, another settler colony. There's also been the displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and Australia is also constructed as a migrant community. Some of the Indigenous scholars here have been working on defining, talking about Australia as a place that has this deep ideology, operates on on what is it, a white possessive logic. And this is informed by some African American scholarship also, this concept. And I think Aileen Morton Robinson speaks about the role of whiteness and white racial capitalism that shapes this particular settler colony, in writing that Australia was racialized and the way in which we belong, migrants belong, and Indigenous people belong differently, is tied up to the accumulation of capital and the social worth, authority, and ownership that this conferred. The Indigenous were excluded from this condition of belonging. The white body was the norm and the measure for identifying who could belong. She also writes that migrant belonging and non-white migrant belonging is tied to the fiction of terra nullius, that is, that there's no person's land, and the logic of capitalism, because their legal right to belong is sanctioned by the law that enabled the dispossession of Indigenous Australians. So you can see that for me, there was these sorts of connections, or the connections that I ended up drawing between the various forms of settler colonialism, but the centrality of white supremacist ideology that held together places like Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, US, and others. So I find myself searching for a discourse, a language, a frame, to understand our experiences, the community that I came from, their experiences, and what it meant to be migrants who then make lives in different places. I found community psychology as a register, a different register to explore some of these questions. It offered different discourses, ones that talked about the importance of context, the importance about cultural relativity, and also the importance of concepts like empowerment over prevention, I think, at the time. But alongside that, it is also an awakening for me around what is social, what are some of the applied psychologies for, and what are some of the core ways in which knowledge systems that informed it. What was the politics of knowledge production in psychology, and who is included and who is out? So those became also extremely important questions for me. And it's through this journey of researching and searching for registers that the marginal psychologies came to the fore. So African psychology, African psychological perspectives, not so much African psychology at the time, that more and more is emerging in the South African context. But the array of psychologies that was available, whether it's cultural psychology, Black psychology, and in particular liberation psychology, and the different places where these forms of psychology were created, and how some of that, once I got interested in it, how they could be mobilized in the work that I was doing. And the work was really about driven by what harms does psychology do as a profession? How does it produce absences? How does it produce ignorances? And then what are the possibilities of reversing those? And these psychologists spoke to that, but some of it didn't necessarily ask some of the basic questions about who's psychology, what is psychology for, and how do we do it? And I think also the gaps that I found in terms of, where are the communities that I identify with in these representations, and how is it that these communities are always and often misrepresented or misrecognized or presented in ways that positions them as inferior others. So out of these journeys, out of these encounters with different forms of knowledge, we've had this ongoing effort that draws on, and I think sometimes I call it a foraging practice, and sometimes I think we can call it or think of it as an assemblage, assembling ways of knowing and doing, inspired by, I think, Indigenous scholars like Linda Tui White-Smith's critical work that she's presented to us on decolonizing methodologies. And so for me, part of this has been the sorts of traveling, or the traveling across contact zones, the traveling across into Indigenous spaces, critical race literatures, and so forth, and crafting or finding ways to understand both what it is that we produce, how we produce knowledge, and the relationship between knowledge making and our various communities, and the centrality of power in that process, and even the power of the university. So with the colleague Mariolga Reyes Cruz, we came together at a conference, and she's from Puerto Rico, and we sort of had shared very similar trajectories in our respective places, and so we brought together the ways in which we were thinking about this work, and she spoke about how she was drawing on Pierre Bourdieu's work, and I talked about the fact that I was grappling with using cultural psychology as a vehicle to bring whiteness studies, which was very absent in psychology at the time. Although, if it was present in psychology, it was reduced to thinking about identity as opposed to as a system, or as a metaphor for a system, and so part of what we did then was to bring this into conversation with this decolonial literature that was sitting outside of psychology, but very prominent in Latin American sort of context. So through this sort of world traveling, we articulated a sort of a standpoint, a sort of an embrace of critical literatures, of feminist scholarship, and so forth, and a very dynamic orientation that commits itself to understanding power and the various expressions of power, and draws on tools to think through and understand and conceptualize the various ways in which we can understand power, but always centrally in that is also the role of knowledge production, knowledge producers, and so on. I mean, what is it that we do, and whose knowledge counts? So we sort of said that, I mean, for us, a decolonial perspective, I think, counters the essentialist understandings, but brings into clearer view the dynamic of power and oppression, and where it is produced through research, through particular forms of racialized, ethnicized practices, discourses, and how social equality continues to be produced. So it's a very generative, iterative sort of orientation that we articulated. And it resonates also with some of the ways in which Nelson Maldonado Torres and the critical decolonial scholars have centered the importance of understanding hierarchies, understanding power, understanding with a very long historical lens, practices that dehumanize, yeah, and that destroys nature, destroys systems, and so on. So this is ongoing work, of course, for us, and part of where we are at the moment. And this is something that we published recently, and we published a figure as is. This is something that emerged out of brainstorms with some of my colleagues, and one of them, obviously a lot more artistic than I am, came up with and captured this for us in some way. So we talked about this as holding a number of things for us. We refer to this as a sort of a solidarity praxis, as an ethical sort of orientation, I think, as the various ways in which we stand up for, we stand up as, we stand up with those who are positioned as marginalized epistemic communities, and the sort of work that they want to do, and that they need, and that we need to do, in the pursuit of self-determination, justice, and flourishing of willful subjectivities. So again, as I've said, there's always ongoing work there to materialize these hopes. And we argue that we have to move against monological theories. And we hear a lot more now about dialogical work, or the pluriversality, the pluriversal, as opposed to very singular universalist understandings of psychology and people in context. So this little figure here, we've called it ecologies of well-being, and we're always thinking about situated knowing, or creating settings in place. And we've got in the red, you can see in the red, we've got little purple, and this is just to differentiate, but the red, I think you can see there's a series of ideologies, I think, that is problematic, and part of what we seek to do is to challenge and make those visible, and the effects or impacts of centering neoliberalism and neoliberal well-being. The dehumanization that happens once we embrace decontextual, acultural, ahistorical approaches to knowledge production and ways of knowing, or centering only the biological or biomedical in psychological inquiry. And then, of course, there's lots written about weird sorts of psychologies, and I'm in a weird context, I think, in the Australian context, but we also import and often import knowledges that circulates through the mainstream and dominant journals and publish with the global economy of publishing, where how knowledge goes in one direction and not in both. So there's these sorts of ongoing practices. So we say that, well, part of what we have to do is we have to always understand how this works in the work that we do. And so we've opened up and we've embraced, and we're always in search, as others have. I think Helen, you and a number of other people have written that great book on decolonial psychology, where we also see the way in which people are exploring epistemic justice, relational praxis, decolonial approaches, dialogical multiplication. So these are some of the sorts of approaches that we embrace or that we seek, so that we can engage in decolonial praxis or an ethical praxis or liberatory praxis. And epistemic justice is something that has been very central, because we've seen that this weirdness has been represented as a form of doing epistemic harm, because of the imposition of ways of being as universal. In Australia, the US, and so on, we've seen lots of writing about people critiquing the way in which Eurocentric, and I think it's the Eurocentric, a particular version, heterosexual men and power and privilege are all captured in one sort of image. So there's lots of writing, and I don't need to rehearse some of this this year. And I think the purple section there also tells us a little bit about that. A lot of this isn't for me, I think, and for everyone who reads in the space, a lot of this isn't new. There's absent knowledges, invisible knowledges, and some talk about this as the sociology of absences, or how absences have been produced through particular ignorances, and in our fields too. This happens. So we're always in pursuit of or engaging with these concepts to understand what do they look like and how can we think about them? How can we theorize, and how can theorizing be a praxis that we engage with the communities that we align ourselves with? Let me see then. I've got a little timer here, and it's telling me that I'm going slow. So part of the, oops, sorry, I'll just return to this. So part of what we are doing, you can see the links between these different the red, the purple, and so forth, the frames that we embrace as we try to imagine and reimagine, and what it is that we can do with and through psychology, and sometimes psychology has its limits, and so there's a very strong transdisciplinarity that's invoked here, and a lot of what we have done and what I've done has come to fruition through encounters with different communities of people, whether they are migrant communities, indigenous communities, or the people, or different professional groups who work with who partner communities, and I'll provide some examples of this. So some of what's also captured here is that we are interested in finding ways to promote epistemic inclusion or epistemic freedom, as Nguvu Gatseni writes about this, where communities of people have got spaces to create knowledge, and their knowledges can be valued and also contested. It's not without contestation. Indigenous people who I align with often speak about self-determination, and having autonomy. The young people from the African diaspora that we work with, they also talk about having access to resources to create self-determined futures. And some of the spaces that we work in, culture, art, culture, cultural practice is very central to the work that we do. And the concepts that people have been putting forward and that they embrace moves from psychologized forms of well-being, but speaks about healing, connection to country, connection to place, retrieving histories, having access to histories. So the forms of decolonial praxis that emerges out of this includes various forms of indigenization or indigenizing. It includes archival retrieval in the same way that my grandfather's invocation was understand the history, understand what has come to be through historical practices of exclusion, and then imagine the alternative. So archival retrieval, or in the liberation psychology sense, recovering collective memory or historical memory as a liberation practice. So what do these sorts of things look like, and how do we do them, or how do we support or accompany or work with groups of people at this university community interface has been the ongoing questions that we have as we try to imagine and reimagine the work that we do as critical community psychology. So now I'll just share three projects. I can see that I've got maybe about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I don't want to speak for too long. So this is just to show you some examples of. It's not like that figure. It's not an overarching framework, but it's an assembling of the way in which our reflexive practices of thinking about, well, what is it that we try to do, and what language makes sense for us to say this is the way in which we want to mobilize and apply psychological inquiry, or how we want to do community engaged research and action. So this is just one project that people can maybe have. I think we can have a look at it, but there's a couple of books on this, and it's a project that I was involved with, called the Apartheid Archive Project, which ran from 2011 or all the way. It's not only 2013 because people are still busy with a lot of this work, but it was a project that was started to provide an opportunity for people to share their stories of growing up during the apartheid period. So that's for anyone and everyone who could come. It's a fairly ambitious project. And I participated in this as someone who was in Australia, and also collected stories from the South African diaspora. We centered storytelling, we centered memory as key concepts, and these came from various disciplines. But the role of storytelling and the opportunity for people to metabolize and for people to be able to share stories about their experiences of growing up, we said was a very central site for understanding where and how race and racialized ideologies penetrated, got under the skin, became a sort of, as Pauline Sachalo names it, a poison in the marrow. But also then how people undo that, and in what ways can they do so. So for me, part of this work happened in the Australian context through speaking with people or being with community and observing and understanding the sorts of things that our communities of people were doing to make sense of and to disable racism and its implications for them as they pursue and develop and create new ways of being in a place away from South Africa. So for some, there was a lot of resentment about South Africa. For others, there was a complete distancing from it. And for others, there was clear understandings of the ideology and the work that needs to happen as we reconstruct and come to understand what it meant to have been categorized as colored, or the differences or the divisions that were crafted by fragmenting the population. So we have So part of this work for us continues. I think some of the recent work we created, what did we call it? We called it a sound portrait, and it was a collection of people's stories that we made available through a public installation. And I can share some of these things so that people can hear what it is that we did. But our argument in that work was that we need to bring, or we can use digital technology or art or creative modalities to bring people's stories into into the public sphere, and for people to witness or to hear or to have these encounters. So a lot of the work that we do, I think, is about creating encounter spaces, but it also centers stories and storytelling as not just as a method, but as a way of being and a way of knowing in the world. So that original work, I think the work with the Apartheid Archive project was extremely important for me, who was out of South Africa. And so part of what I did in this context was to look at, I mean, how do we also mobilize storytelling? And I think the work with Indigenous communities in Australia had centered storytelling as methodology, as a method, and as a way of knowing, as very central to also to the truth-telling projects that happens here, or the decolonial projects that happens here. So a second, this quote here comes from a more recent paper, which is in the Social Personality Compass, and it's in a special issue that Michelle Fine and Puleng Sagalo is putting together on university community and spaces for freedom dreaming. And in it, in this article, we write with three young people from the African diaspora who we've been working with since, I don't know, maybe 2012. And they've called themselves Next in Color. They are young creatives who use arts and cultural practice to create spaces and to support the empowerment of the African diaspora and young African youth. So we've accompanied them through multiple projects that they have that we have imagined with them. And this particular article captures some of that. So moving from the stories that they tell through theater, where the theater becomes the mechanism for them to create, tell, and be in control of their own stories, as opposed to the ones that circulate via media that often vilifies, racializes, or writes of them as culturally incompatible and non-belonging. They've moved through these different phases of creating Next in Color and creating this collective, up to the point now where they've created a new space, which was just recently, where they speak about Black wealth, and it's a way in which they, not just economic wealth, but they talk about, and I think it's to some extent also informed by critical race scholarship around the cultural capitals that communities have, but are silenced or made invisible or othered. And so they reclaim Black wealth in public spaces through forums, through creating community. And so part of this is for us to wrestle with, I mean, how do we think through the types of relationships, and how do we think about the community university? What is it that not centering the university, but I think thinking through the hyphen about the university community interface. And as I've said at the start, that I think a lot of this for us is about attending to the dynamics of power and privilege, and also asking, how are we creating counter spaces as a node, or connecting multiple relations? And this is the idea of multiple or dialogical multiplication, and the various networks that we belong to. And how do we mobilize Kelly's notion of freedom dreaming through cultural practice, critical solidarity practice with the academy? So So one example of us doing some of this work is in one of the more recent projects that we've been working on, and this one emerges to some extent out of the COVID moment, and we had horribly restrictive practices here, and lots written about the impact on social connection, the mental health of young people. And so Future Reset is a project that we partnered with a health organization called Vic Health, which is a Victorian health foundation. And they had this process of centering collaboration, relationship, and equity as the principles along which they would distribute their funding. And the other part of this is that it had to be youth-led. And we, as a team, was recruited to support the process of creating these collectives over a period of time. And we're in this second year of this work now. So each of these collectives were charged with and funded to mentor young people, but for young people to create and imagine place-based activities that could contribute to social connection and mental health, well-being as some of the key things. So there's nine collectives, and they've come up with some amazing work, not without its challenges, because different agencies, communities, when they work with community groups, there's ways in which they want to remain in control and in charge and so forth. And so we as researchers have been in and part of the process. We haven't gone in as evaluators and so forth. We've thought that we could imagine and think with the groups about how to execute this group, how to execute their work, and how to document their work, and then to theorize the change process. And so this is where we're at with this group at the moment. So part of what we've done is we've spoken with a number of the young creatives. We've reviewed a lot of the literature around where is and how do people think and write about decoloniality in community practice and community arts practice. And we've identified several of the mechanisms. So, I mean, the typical ones that everyone would be familiar with, I think, is around critical consciousness, creating safe spaces, home places, opportunities for people to digest. But we've also identified what we've referred to here as relationality. And some people write about relationality as decolonial love. I think this is an emphasis on relationship as central. Spending time with building relationships as central to the practice that we do. One of the young people who's in our project expressed the importance of relationship and finding relationship in her journey, and she's now also one of those who've become a key leader in this work. Another person spoke about, or we've captured this as communality. Instead of community, it's communality, and this is the sort of solidarity practice of becoming community, or becoming committed to shared sorts of agendas. And there's always this attention to what are the hierarchies that gets in the way of the possibilities of being in community with people. So Miriam, also one of the young youth leaders on this project, spoke a little bit about what this means for her, and what it means to have traveled back to her home country, and then coming back here to figure out, well, what does it actually mean to tell alternative and different stories about who we are and who we can be in this place. So that particular project, as I've said, is ongoing, and I can also share links of where this work is captured for people. But the key thing here is that we've tried to reimagine what it means to accompany, and how research practices can be mobilized as forms of accompaniment in the process of standing with communities of people as they pursue their self-determined practices of freedom in their local places. We've, as Helen said earlier, we've got a number of podcasts, and so this we've also captured as a podcast. Part of the reason that we do this is that we don't only want to turn people's stories into interviews that we then digest and publish. We actually value the contributions that they make as resources, as knowledge, as experiences that people can understand. So people themselves are epistemic agents. They live and tell stories in and of the world. And so we put these together as collective interventions also to say that there are knowledges here that we also have to value and create through our resources and our access to resources, opportunities to make them public as forms of public intervention. And the final thing I'll mention is where I am at the moment. It is at Mundani Balak, the Indigenous Center at Victoria University. And I have been working with this group ever since I've come back from, I used to work in Western Australia, ever since I've come back from Western Australia in various projects, negotiating my place, negotiating roles in it. So through indigenizing curriculum, that is centering or creating spaces within mainstream psychology curricula to include, and in this case it was including, and I think inclusion is probably a little bit problematic. But at the time when we were doing this work, to include as a pathway to cultural safety or awareness raising was important. So we've grown our work from moving from teaching practice to imagining research projects in the context of Indigenous placemaking. So Mundani Balak means to embrace. The symbolism here is significant. It's an image drawn by one of my colleagues, Dr. Paula Bella, who is an artist scholar at Mundani Balak. And so this image captures the relationship between Indigenous people, the university, and also the river that's near where we are at university. So Mundani Balak is a place of storytelling, of recovery, of historical memory, and as creating and producing critical inquiry and participatory Aboriginal research, which is a term that Aboriginal scholars I've coined here, that centers Indigenous ways of knowing in a participatory oriented transformative framework. And there's a lot of work that we also do on advocacy and in engagement. So this particular one here, you can see this is a whole new building, but all informed and designed with Indigenous principles in mind, or with Indigenous cultural practices in mind. And I'm just saying here, so there's a couple of concepts here that's sort of important. So protecting country as a driver for the work that we do. And so this particular building was built on the experiences of placemaking with Indigenous people in the Western areas of Melbourne, where communities have been either displaced, made invisible, but now there's a lot more work in the context of truth-telling in Victoria, at least, although in 2003 we had this horrible outcome of the referendum, which was also contested, where people had said that no, we don't want to change to the constitution that would set up a committee on how Indigenous people would be included in the constitution of the country. So that was a setback, but like I said, not all Aboriginal people were in support of that either. But the struggle for sovereignty and self-determination continues in these local places at the university and also in the surrounding community. So a lot of the work here is about country, about place, land, and culture, and the intimate connections between that and the different ways in which Indigenous people's knowledges are tied to identity and belonging. So I've got some quotes there that people can see. And Al Thorpe, he also works at our university, but he's seconded to the treaty authority at the moment, because in Victoria we have this process treaty making that's been going for the last 2 years, and accompanied with that is an inquiry into the legacy of colonialism and its ongoing effects, and it's called the Uruk Justice Commission. So this so that placemaking work there is the actual physical transformation, creating safe spaces within the university. And the lady with the white hair is is the director, but she's also the person documenting this journey of placemaking over a period of 20 years. And the role of, and all of the plants that you see there, these are all native plants and so on. So there's a couple of other projects related to this, including Indigenous dietary practices, memory, and placemaking. So a lot of cultural retrieval, cultural remembering, and creating safe places and transforming the university on the inside in some sort of way. This other project here, the images from this is from a project that was called Black Women's Healing. And Paula Bella led this, and the flowers, the collection of flowers. This is sort of a mindfulness practice where people go on country and they learn about flowers and so forth, and they use the process of bush dyeing to create scarves and imprints and so forth. But through the process of being together, the actual process of being in a space and speaking and retrieving and remembering, important work happens through the storytelling process. And we've documented and written about this form of intervention, well, probably not an intervention, this form of community making and recovery, of reconnecting people who were typically members of the stolen generations in the Australian context. So there's active efforts, like the little note says, there's active efforts of reconnecting with and understanding history, and then imagining futures together. So I feel like I've rushed, and I'm seeing the clock here that there might be a little bit of time left. But so at the outset, I've said that, I mean, so much of what I've done is tied also to my own experiences and with racialization and structures that have. And so the search had always been, or the struggle had always been to understand those, and what role psychology can play, if any, and what type of psychology I could invest in as we create ways of working with, and community psychology had always said that it is working with people. And so part of this journey had been to fill in what are the absences in a community psychology that we've imported from the US, and what will it look like, or what can it look like in this context. So there's always this process of localizing while in conversation with the global circuits of knowledge. So for us at the moment, there's an investment in knowledges from below, from Indigenous struggles, from community memory, from the diaspora. That's our focus, and it's the basis for radical imagination. We seek to advance approaches and methods that elevate the lived experience, lived concerns, and pedagogical imperatives of freedom, anguish, responsibility, embodied agency, sociality, and liberation. To recognize our different social locations, historical inheritance, and the implications of this co-intentional action for racial justice. To use privilege as academic scholars, we are always looking to create spaces within, outside the university as a public good, where people can feel safe, be nurtured, and their cultural identity strengthened rather than eroded or diminished. A key definition of cultural safety in this context. And that's it, with 9 minutes to go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Sonn and Dr. Sonn. And I think we do have some questions. So we're opening the floor now for questions. So please, we invite you to post your questions in the Q&A. And we already have a question for you. So an anonymous attendee is asking, could you speak to the value of researching whiteness and or perpetrator psychology in a field and world where these perspectives have historically been centered?
Oh, good question. So look, for me, I think it has been really important to research whiteness, and I came to this because I had a lot of and I had a lot of students who ostensibly were identified as white. When we went into the Aboriginal Center, they would come and they would say, "Oh my God, we want to help, or we want to," and Aboriginal people would say that, don't they know we don't need the help. They need to look at the origins of the problem. And so whiteness, and I think the North American writing, I think Ruth Frankenberg and some others who had written at the time, there's a lot there in the 1900s. So the stuff from Mills, I think, on the racial contract. We've got critical whiteness studies as an area, and lots of people trace this work back to Du Bois, W.E. Du Bois' work as someone who had studied these systems. I think Frantz Fanon's work is extremely important if we think about whiteness as a metaphor for coloniality or forms of coloniality, but not just to attach us to white people, but the very systems that we live and breathe with. And I think this is the sort of conception of whiteness that I draw on, so that it opens up the possibilities for us to understand the various ways of being that get centered and whose ways of being get centered. So there's also Melissa Steyn in South Africa who've created critical diversity literacy as an orientation, and that's very helpful ways in which she's articulated and thought about mobilizing and using whiteness. Then of course there's the work here that Professor Aileen Morton Robinson on whiteness as episteme. And there's a recent book that was published here in the Australian context by Australian scholars called Critical Racial Literacy, I think it's called. But this also looks at at how we need to think about race and how we need to develop racial literacies, and whiteness as a theoretical conceptual orientation that looks into, I mean, how is it that whiteness comes to be a dominant modality, and whiteness as a metaphor for dominance and normativity, I think. And so that's how we've been using this this concept. And like I've also said, I think the decolonial literature doesn't necessarily, and I think the critique of some of the decolonial literature has been that it's taken race, it silences race a little bit. But I think our work is that it has to be in there as part of the intersecting structures. And so a lot of the decolonial work is always about understanding coloniality, modernity, and decoloniality as entangled. Yep. And so that's part of the orientation. I hope that answers that question.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant answer, in fact. And I think building on that question, there's also been an addition, if there are any particular frameworks or tools you would recommend approaching those topics in a way that aligns with the decolonial perspective. And if you've shared some resources, but do you have particular tools or frameworks that you would like to refer us to?
Sorry, I've muted myself. Sometimes I'm framework averse because the decolonial work doesn't like to fix things. So often I would talk about coordinates, and often the coordinates that we use are around ethical sorts of, I mean, I know Michelle Fine often writes this in her work about who is this work for? Who are you accountable to? On whose terms? And I think that's a really important question. They're not necessarily frameworks, but they are the questions that orient us to, okay, well, what are the sorts of things that we need to consider when we partner with different communities of people? So I use the work of Stephen Biko, but you'll see that Stephen Biko's work is influenced by Fanon, was Fanon's work, and Ngugi. So once you read I think the work of subaltern scholars or people whose knowledges have been outside of the system, those are some of the starting points for understanding whiteness. I think it's extremely important to access the literatures that have been around forever, but it's not been centered in any curriculum. Yeah? So for me, Indigenous writing has been extremely important as a way to make visible the operations of whiteness in this context. It wasn't going in necessarily through whiteness, but it was understanding from these perspectives, feminist perspectives. All of these are extremely important perspectives. They don't provide necessarily frameworks, they provide insights into standpoints that makes visible normativity, dominance, power. And I think that's the sort of way that I've always approached this. Instead of looking into or finding people do write about frameworks. And like I said, Melissa Stein's Critical Diversity Literacy, the book that they've developed provides a sort of a framework for how to do critical diversity work within organizational contexts. So that would be one that I think is very useful if you wanted to go into it through that. I think even Peggy McIntosh's work originally, the Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, has been very important work because it gives you the sorts of questions that the particular questions that people ask about, well, what are the sorts of assumptions that I'm making about myself and others in the world? So those are still very useful tools. If you were looking for tools, I think that would be useful as a starting point, and then you would also look at applying that in your own context. The other thing is that there's so many disciplines. We had a scholar who studies education who came to speak to us about the work that people are doing in Sweden. I think it is in Sweden or one of the Scandinavian countries, where they were looking at, what are the sorts of ways in which we can promote interculturality or understand interculturality and the different sorts of ways in which that now also considers race in those contexts, because of the way in which migration makes visible the normative, and the way in which migration also makes visible the way in which people want to exclude and so on. But, yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Sonn. And I think we also have another question from Luciana, who thanks you very much for the presentation, especially the appreciating all the references you've shared and the podcast idea. So the question goes is, when talking to white people in historical white spaces about diversity, in the context of wanting to prevent violence and discrimination, but struggling in seeing their own privilege, what would you say are the key aspects to address this topic, given what you presented today?
Oh, let's see if I understand this question. When talking to white people in historical white spaces about diversity, that's struggling to say that white privilege. What do you say are the key aspects to address the resistance or the invisibility or the not wanting to see? to address the not wanting to see is extremely difficult, because if they don't want to see, they don't want to see. I think we had a study that we did, because we created the performance that I mentioned before with this group. They called the performance AMCA, which means to stand up. So it was young people from the African diaspora who wanted to perform their stories of belonging and so forth. And so they presented this to the African diaspora, but they also invited everyone who wanted to come and see the performance. And it was performed at Melbourne, at a main art center in Melbourne. And part of what we asked people who came, people who were witnesses in the audience, we asked them about what they learned about themselves, what they learned about community, and what it is that they learned about this group. And then we only asked them to identify, to say who they are, what groups they belong to. So people would say white Australian or African or Italian or migrant or whatever. And then we looked only at people who identified themselves as some sort of white Australian, and some used Caucasian or some used white Australian. And then we looked at what their responses were. And the range of responses were, people would say that So this idea of psychological distance, how very far apart the worlds are, yeah, life worlds are, so that I never knew that these people were living in this place or that these were their experiences. Some people would say that I resent that you had to make me look at this. It made me feel really uncomfortable. And some people would say, I don't want to hear about the justice stuff anymore. And other people would embrace the opportunity of discomfort to think because it had made them think about their own social locations and so forth. So you'll have a range of responses across, and some people engage with the emotions of guilt. Some people engage with the emotions of shame. And other people engage with with the ideas that we have had a psychological distance between the communities that live in this very society. So it's a form of, it's not a geographical apartheid, it's an actual psychological apartheid that exists because we live in different spaces. So there were multiple responses from people who classified or who identify themselves as white in here. So there's no homogeneous whiteness. There's no homogeneity to whiteness. And we also have to understand the various sorts of ways in which people are socialized into forms of ignorance. And then also what the possibilities are for where can we engage with the discomfort. So I've got students, a PhD student now who's on this journey of looking at how do we actually create spaces for white people who are allies, and how do we engage with their biographies and learn about what would be helpful and so forth to maintain the forms of activism. But the key principle here is that we don't reify whiteness, but we understand the experiences of when you transgressed your group membership, what happens? And then we work with that process and we work with those experiences to then think through the sorts of things that people need to perform solidarity practice at the interface of racial or intergroup relations or racial relations and racial justice.
Fascinating. That's really fascinating. Okay, I'd like to invite any of our panelists, if Dr. Helen or Dr. Thea or Dr. Pina would like to provide any comments or any questions to Dr. Christopher.
Hi, Dr. Christopher. I'm from Durban, South Africa.
Oh, hi. Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Yeah, I just bring you greetings from Durban, South Africa, Western Cape University, Johannesburg University, where I spent a lot of my time in the academic profile. You probably know that Indigenous psychology is kind of gaining momentum in South Africa.
Yes.
Both
yes.
at the teaching level, at the fundamental teaching level, trying to deconstruct the basic constructs that have been taught to students at an undergraduate level and at the graduate level, so that we're preparing our students for the real context that they're going to meet when they go out and practice.
Yes.
Would you have some insights to share with us here, since you come from this context and you probably know a lot about it already? But you probably know that it's changed radically over the last 30 years or so. You know, we've had 30 years of democracy now, so we have got a new sense. Thank you.
Yes. Look, I'm not too sure what I can share. I think South Africa is leading so much of the discourse on decolonization, and I know also that, I mean, there's a strong, and they just recently had a conference, I think, on Indigenous knowledge systems in Cape Town. So I know that there's a lot of activity there, and it's indigenizing psychology, Africanizing psychology, developing African psychology. So people are finding the spaces, but I'm sure that people are also finding the resistances within the higher education systems. Very invested in, who continue to be invested, I guess, in reproducing. I don't know, they're intensely invested in producing ignorances, but the strategies here in the Australian context at the moment, we've just had a major review of universities, and so there's policies that are coming through, and in psychology especially, where the profession is mandated to include Indigenous knowledge systems and also cultural systems. So every university that teaches this, there has to be evidence of them including or teaching or steps towards indigenization. So there's a big effort that I've also gone along with that to look at how do you actually do that in undergraduate, postgraduate, and subsequent levels of study. So there's a very big policy framework and policy effort to actually do this, and I think that is actually quite essential. And so in the psychology profession, there's a very strong partnership with the Australian Indigenous Psychology Association and various bodies to look at how best to develop the frameworks, the resources, and to support groups through that process. We even have, I think, with the Indigenous Psychology Group, they've started. It's called the Australian Indigenous Education Project, and it's version 2 of it. So it's the accumulation of resources, but also developing a community of practice to bring heads of school through, or people who are in charge of the curriculum, to support them through the process of doing this work, because there's a lot of undoing work that needs to happen. And there's also a lot of protection of mainstream curricula because it's foundational knowledge. But I think so all of those things have to be questioned too, because otherwise the Indigenous knowledge becomes, again, an appendage or just something that sits alongside, when ultimately decolonial or indigenization implies also a form of fundamental transformation at the root level. So I think there's those frameworks and institutional supports are extremely important for this type of work, I think.
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, and this has infiltrated the medical education as well, which we find that's very gratifying in many ways. Just want to share something. On the 12th of December, we have Dr. Sats Cooper, a friend of Steve Biko.
Yes.
He's be presenting a webinar. You might be interested. I just thought.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very interesting.
Well,
sorry, go on. I was just going to say to Theophilus that I actually started my studies at the University of the Western Cape. Yeah. And then, when we left, my whole goal was to go back home, and I ended up studying, and I'm still studying.
Wow. So I assume Franklin Sonn was related to you?
Yeah, he's my dad's cousin.
Right. Okay. He was quite a revolutionary at Western Cape. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, Pina.
No. It's so nice to see the convergences of theoretical aspects, methodologically, but also personal connection. It sounds like. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Chris. Has been an extremely interesting webinar, and I think it's the beginning of a possible form of collaboration with Division 52, not only in the form of webinar, but maybe in the, let's say, different form of you having, let's say, contributing to our different initiatives. And I really want to thank Helen for her incredible work in order to make this possible. This has been an initiative. This has been a webinar series that was built on the idea of interdivisional connection. And today we have proven that the interdivisional connection is always, they produce an extremely good result. So we look forward to more activity, new collaboration, new initiatives. Thanks a lot, Helen. Thanks to all the participants. Thanks to Theo and Tatiana and Raffaele for the great work in organizing everything. And so this webinar is recorded, so will be available to anybody on the Division 52 webinar web page. So thanks a lot. Okay. Final words, Helen? Yeah.
Just want to I'm aware that we're over. Just thank you, Pina, for your vision. And thank you, Dr. Sonn, for your incredible thought-provoking presentation. I learned a lot about decolonial psychologies, both in terms of theory and practice. And I commend you and your collaborators on really pushing the field forward. So with deep appreciation.
Thank you very much, everyone. Helen, thank you for reaching out to me. And I mean, this has opened up another community I think when we have people that around the world doing this sort of work, it's always exciting for me. I'd be more than happy to have more conversations with you as we go, and as we find each other in this really important, significant global time of transformation.
Tatiana, please go ahead with the final words. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you very much again. We're indebted to your fascinating webinar topic today, Dr. Christopher Sonn, and also to your amazing work. And we'd like to invite everyone to mark your calendars for November 25 for our upcoming webinar on the HIV Stigma Index 2.0. And we'll have a brilliant speaker, Dr. Angelo Brandelli Costa, who will speak to us on that topic. So please be on the lookout, and we'll be sending reminders via our own listserv as well. Looking forward to having you join us in the upcoming webinar. Have a great rest of the day, night, morning, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tatiana.